Since the speaker is David Bowler, President of the Perthshire Society of Natural Science, I can say without much fear of contradiction that he really needs no introduction to most of us. However, for the benefit of any visitors and guests, I'd like to say that our president is a professional archaeologist and the director of Alder Archaeology. He's also a very active and committed member of the PSNS's Archaeological and Historical section. He's a man of wide-ranging interests and, following in the best traditions of the Society's founding fathers, he's a true polymath. This evening, he's going to talk to us about the Greyfriars Burial Ground here in Perth, and I very much look forward to hearing what he has to say. Over to you, David.
I've just unmuted myself, so can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
That's good. And now I shall share my screen and I shall switch over, if I can, to the slideshow. There we are. So now everyone should be, is everyone seeing my slides? And
yep.
So now we can get going. Yes. Greyfriars Burial Ground. I think many of you will know where it is and will have been in there and will know that it's in the southwest corner of the centre of Perth, just outside the city walls. It was the site of a Franciscan friary which was dissolved at the Reformation and became a public burial ground in 1580, because by then the old public burial ground around St John's Kirk was enormously crowded and more than full. And so there was a perceived need for a new municipal burial ground, and that became Greyfriars. So, in addition to looking at Greyfriars itself, I want to look at it in the context of its cultural history. There are lots of different things you can do in a burial ground. Some people will focus on family history and others will focus on the names of sort of famous characters. Our for many years much esteemed Secretary Rhoda Fothergill was a great one for talking about some of the famous Perth characters who were buried in Greyfriars. My own take on the burial ground is slightly different, and I tend to think of it in a framework of cultural history. So I'll be looking at Greyfriars, but looking at other things as well. One of them is the famous Scottish graveyard school of poets in the 18th century. The most famous being Robert Blair, whose masterpiece, if that's the right word, The Grave, an epic poem of meditation on death, was published in 1743, I think it was. And then a sort of deluxe edition came out in 1808, illustrated by William Blake. Much to Blake's disgust, he wasn't engaged to do the actual engravings. An Italian named Schiavonetti did the engravings, but from Blake's designs. But I think I may well be the only person living who's actually read The Grave from beginning to end. It gets a mention in some of the Scottish playwrights, like Maclellan, as a sort of a peculiar feature of 18th century Scottish culture. Blair had terrible trouble getting it published, but eventually the English hymn writer Isaac Watts down in my old hometown of Southampton took pity on him and found a publisher for him, and it became a bestseller. It became one of those things that everybody had in their house, along with the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress and Shakespeare. The thing to have was Robert Blair's The Grave. Robert Burns quotes from it extensively in some of his poetry. So you get this really curious thing that this very improbable style of solemn poetry, meditating on death and the grave, really takes off and becomes an important part of English-speaking culture worldwide, and certainly in Scotland. It's perceived as one of Scotland's special contributions to the literature of the English-speaking world. Blake, as that's his own portrait of himself, which was included in the deluxe edition of 1808. The other thing I want to look at as we look at Greyfriars is what you might call the grammar of the stones, because Greyfriars in Perth is perhaps more than some other burial grounds. The 18th century stones especially follow quite closely certain rules. Typically at the top of the stone, you have that face with the wings. That's not meant to be an angel or a cherub. That's a winged soul. The idea is that the soul is, we hope, going up the way from the top of the gravestone. At the bottom, you normally have symbols of mortality, the skull, the crossed bones, the hourglass, and there's various other things. And so that symbolism of the winged soul going up and the symbols of mortality going down, and as we'll see, they often actually sink into the ground as the stone under its own weight sinks into the soft earth. That's quite deliberate. Normally you have the Latin inscription as here, memento mori, which literally means remember to die, which is an odd sort of thing to say, but what it means is remember death. That or some other similar saying is usually just above the symbols of mortality. And then in the middle, you usually have some kind of symbolism relating to the life of the person who's buried. So for example, here we have a baxter. And so we have a wheat sheaf and the baker's shovels or paddles with the loaves of bread on them, because you put the bread into the oven on wooden paddles and whisk it out again when it's ready. So we have the baker's shovels, and then on the other side of the stone you would have the inscription with the names and dates of the people involved. And sometimes on this side of the stone, the side with the sort of the graphics, you'll have their initials. So there's so what I want to be looking at is the cultural framework and the grammar, as it were, of how these stones are organized and the way that people play with variations on themes. Another thing to look at, this is a very slightly later stone from, I think, 1840, but it's a factor in how the culture develops. First, that gravestones tend to be not just for individuals, but for whole families, that once a stone has been set up, it will be reused and added to almost infinitum. And the other thing, the sheer number of people who will appear on the family gravestone, because of the very, very high infant mortality in the 18th century, and even more so in the 19th and well into the 20th. You get, if anything, I think the 19th century is probably experiencing higher mortality than the 18th, as the population increases, as people move out of the countryside into the towns, as air pollution becomes much more serious, and as things like cholera become much more common. And that pattern, it affects how the stones are designed. They're so crowded. But I think it also explains some odd features of the culture, that the preoccupation with death, that what may seem a degree of gloominess in much of the funerary culture, that we wouldn't go in for so much today, is partly because mortality is so high, that whereas for most people today, the death of children is, I'm glad to say, a very, very rare and tragic occurrence. But in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, it would happen to every family. Up to a certain point, you could say that was what the majority of children did, that growing up was the exception, not the rule. And so that sense of being constantly mentally preparing yourself for death and thinking of it is a big part of the culture. As Robert Blair so helpfully puts it, sure, it is a serious thing to die, which seems seems a little bit like stating the obvious, but it's very much part of his culture and part of the culture of the time to feel that it's good for you to consciously meditate on the reality of death and the presence of death and the sense of it being present with you all the time. William Law, in A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life, suggests as a devotional exercise that every night as you go to bed, you should imagine that you've just been buried. And that's what, I don't know if anyone else did it, but that's the way that people felt and thought. There's the idea of the separation of body and soul, the feeling of it being unnatural and yet inevitable. For part they must, body and soul must part. This wings its way to its almighty source. So there's the winged soul going up the way, the witness of its actions, now its judge. That drops into the dark and noisome grave, like a disabled picture of no use. So exactly what you see on the gravestones, with the winged soul at the top, and the skull and crossbones and the hourglass at the bottom. And it's, if you read something like The Grave, and there were other authors who wrote similar things, it's fascinating to see how closely the iconography of the stones and the symbolism in the poetry match each other, that they're each copying the other, and that there's a cultural conversation going on between different art forms in a common framework. And that's what I find so interesting. When you let someone like William Blake loose on that sort of material, it's obvious that you are going to get the most extraordinary results. So this is Blake's interpretation of body and soul must part, with the soul, as it were, floating away from the body. Blake was in many ways a very suitable person to pick to illustrate The Grave, because he actually believed very strongly in the reality of visions and prophecies, and he felt that he had the gift of seeing all sorts of things that other people didn't see. He also believed very strongly that you should represent these things in a very literal and concrete sort of way. That for him, the spiritual world wasn't something ghostly or immaterial, quite the opposite. It was something incredibly solid. And so when he's let loose on Robert Blair's poem, he takes the most metaphorical images and literalizes them in the most extreme way that he can, because that's how his mind works. And so the effects are quite astonishing, as here, but fit rather well with the Blake's self-conscious literalism fits rather well with the naive literalism of the 18th century stones, that whereas later material that we'll see is either commercial or highly artistic, in the 18th century it's vernacular. It's the same sort of artistic tradition that would produce a pub sign is producing the decoration of gravestones. It's local men who are masons by trade and artists secondly, in a very simple and straightforward and down-to-earth way, representing familiar themes in a familiar way. And so, again, that makes for a very interesting cultural conversation. This is a nice example of one of the 18th century stones in Greyfriars. And it is the 18th century that's best represented. If you go to the Howth in Dundee, you'll see lots of much earlier stones. But in Perth, we lost a lot of the early stones because they were taken away to build Cromwell's Citadel during the Civil War, and Greyfriars was plundered quite extensively. So the most interesting stones in Greyfriars are mostly from the 18th century rather than earlier. But here's the kind of simple pub sign kind of artistry of a carter's grave. This man, a carter, I think, in Bridge End. So we have his horse and cart in the middle, a rather nice winged soul above, usual symbols of mortality at the bottom. Interesting how the enormous variation in the realism of the skull and crossbones, especially the skull. It's obvious that the mason who carved this skull hasn't spent a lot of time actually looking at skulls, and is just doing a very stylized, symbolic sort of skull. But sometimes you will see, lifelike is the wrong word, very realistic, very naturalistic skulls, from some people who obviously have some anatomical knowledge. I'm not quite sure what the thing is that's above the horse. It might be a horse blanket, but that seems a bit silly. It might be a mort cloth or something of that sort. There's this tradition that you can hire from the parish a mort cloth to drape over the coffin while it's on the way to the grave. If you want, you can even hire the coffin. There's a tradition of having what's called a slip coffin with like bomb doors underneath. You lower it down to the grave, pull a cord, it goes click, and the doors open, bombs away, and you lift the coffin out. And so it's a reusable coffin. I did actually once have occasion to make arrangements for obtaining a second-hand coffin for burying some skeletons on an excavation in Fife. The man who provided it to me didn't explain quite how he'd managed to source it. I think, I suppose undertakers probably have demonstrators the same way that used cars dealers do, or something like, I don't know, something like that. But anyway, that wasn't my problem. That representation of your life in the midst of death isn't just in Greyfriars, and each of the cemeteries around Perth does it slightly differently. This is from Canoe Graveyard, one of the many ferrymen's gravestones or boatmen's gravestones in Canoe. But again, you have the winged soul at the above in the normal way, and if you look closely at the bottom, you'll see a skull and crossbones and hourglass disappearing beneath the turf. And then in the middle, you have the symbols of this person's life, which include a boat, a fish, and up in the top left corner, what I think is a sock and coulter, the metal parts of a plough. So this man was also doing a bit of cultivation. You don't see all that many farmers' gravestones in Greyfriars. If you go out into the country parishes, you will see quite often the sock and coulter, the sock being the iron or yes, it probably is iron rather than steel at this period, point at the tip of the ploughshare, and the coulter being that vertical knife that looks a bit like a machete, which cuts the vertical cut in the furrow before it's turned over. But you see a lot of those in the rural graveyards. And I couldn't resist bringing this one in from Canoe as well, of a ferryman with his punt pole and his boat and his rather wonderful hat. Notice at the top, instead of a winged soul, what you have is an angel with wings and a trumpet. So if you want to put resurrection on a gravestone, naturally you put it at the top. So you'll have your symbols of mortality at the bottom and symbols of resurrection at the top. We don't do a lot of resurrection in Perth. It's not that sort of place, but we do have a little bit of resurrection in Greyfriars, as we'll see. That's the back of that stone, with the details of the 18th century date and the person's name. A lot of the nicer stones in Greyfriars are gathered under a shelter at the south end of the burial ground now. Some of you might remember Mike Messenger, who sadly is no longer with us, but who was a landscape architect with Perth Council, and who did a huge amount of work to restore and conserve Greyfriars Burial Ground. The shelter was his design, and getting the stones put under it. When you're doing things in graveyards, a detail matters. And so, for example, that gravel mix that forms the floor, as it were, of the graveyard and was laid down to resurface the paths as well, that was very carefully chosen. It's a mixture of lime and wind dust and other things. It drains freely, it stops the weeds, but it's not visually intrusive. It's not like having a yellow brick road or something that spoils the atmosphere of the place. And yet, 20 years later, it's still in very good condition. I can remember if you went around Greyfriars, it was like a quagmire sometimes. But ever since that material was put down, which was chosen by Mike, it's always been dry underfoot and always been clean and solid with very little maintenance. So that's part of the detail. That's a glover's stone that we're looking at there. The glovers, of course, are a very important craft in medieval and early modern Perth. And so there are quite a few very grand glover's stones in Perth. You can see in the middle the pair of gloves. I'm not sure if can you see my pointer?
Mm-hmm.
Good. So you've got the pair of gloves there, and shears down there, and a belt.
Yeah.
These vertical things here are the wooden formers on which you make the fingers of the gloves, because of course gloves you make inside out and stitch them with these vertical spool type of things to shape the fingers, and then you turn them back the right way when you've finished. This odd thing above here, and there are some other stones that have this, is a pair of leather breeches, because that was another thing that glovers made, and sometimes it was a masterpiece. In other words, when you finished your apprenticeship, and as a kind of a practice piece to qualify for being a fully qualified glover, you had to make a pair of leather breeches. And so you will see that those on some toes, and they look quite strange. They look like a surgical truss or something, but that's what they are. And that thing in the middle, which we will see more of, this thing here, which you'll see on a lot of the glover's stones, of like a sort of a strap with round things like baubles on it, is of course Morris dancing bells. They're like little sleigh bells fastened to that strap. We tend to think of Morris dancing as A, rather silly, and B, specifically English, but there was a specific tradition in Perth that the glovers had a traditional Morris dance, and even had a special dress for the purpose, which is still kept in Perth Museum. And they did this for various royal visitors, including, I think, Charles II. And so the glovers' dance was traditional, and therefore the possession of the Morris dancing bells was one of the signs of the members of the glover's craft. And that often appears on the gravestones as well, because if you were a glover, you'd be quite proud of it. This is a merchant stone with a rather serious looking winged sole, this time on the back. You don't often get the winged sole on the back of the stone. Notice the change in font as you get down to a 19th century entry. You have the hand-cut 18th century inscription here, done very, very well. And then a change to something which I think is probably done with a template rather than freehand down here, I think in the 19th century. So there's quite a lot of change in the script, and this rather serious looking winged sole. Sometimes the face that goes with the winged sole is intended to be an actual likeness of the individual. And on the other side, you have something which you see a lot in the Perth stones, which is that you take traditional motifs and vary them somewhat. So at the bottom, you've got your traditional crossbones, skull, and hourglass. You've got the initials of the various people. The 4M sign is the sign of the merchants, memento mori in the usual way. Up here, where you might have had a winged sole or something of that sort, what you have instead is a bunch of candles tied together at the top. Because this man's a merchant, he might have sold candles. And of course, what better thing to put at the top of the gravestone than the symbol of light? Light in our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord. So candles at the top, and behind them, tobacco leaves. Tobacco seems to play quite a part in the representations of the life to come in Perth, because of course the tobacco trade was a big thing in Perth. There were lots of tobacconists, and we'll see tobacco popping up again later, but evidently for this particular merchant, he thought that tobacco leaves were something else that belonged at the top of his gravestone with the symbols of immortality. A sea captain who died, I think, in Madras in India. We don't always think of Perth as being a maritime trading town, but it does have a harbour, and it did have overseas connections. And of course, after the Union of the Crowns, Scots played a very big part in the commercial development of the empire. After the Darien disaster, which left Scotland almost bankrupt, a lot of Scots were keen to go abroad and make their fortunes, and many did. And this man among them, and this is a very expensive stone. It's a flat stone rather than an upright one. You don't see a lot of flat stones as you get later into the 18th century. I'm not sure why the fashion to upright stones takes place. It may be that it's easier to reuse a grave with an upright stone than with a flat one. I'm not sure. But this is a very nice stone indeed. You've got at the bottom a very, very well done naturalistic skull and crossbones and hourglass, the usual memento mori. And at the top, with this heraldic crest and these two gentlemen on either side of it, you've got a very nice detail of the man's ship and a pair of winged souls. But if we look closely, they've done something very clever. These winged souls are doubling up as two of the four winds. If you think of a lot of 18th century maps, and especially maritime charts and earlier, you often have the four winds at the four corners of the map. And so what they have done very cleverly, obviously you're going to have winged souls at the top of your gravestone, but if you're going to have a ship there as well, then it's no good having a ship without some winds to drive it. So they've put two of these winged souls to be the winds as well. And of course, that's very clever because Latin spiritus and Greek pneuma and Hebrew ruach all have the meanings of wind and soul and breath. So you're making a very, very interesting and clever link across languages and cultures by having this fluidity between wings and winged souls and the winds and the spirit. And to drive the message home, underneath the ship, with slightly dodgy spelling, you have ready, I, ready. And that, of course, is the refrain from that well-known patriotic song that's sung in the Royal Navy. Cheer up, brave lads, 'tis to glory we steer, hearts of oak are our ships, etc., etc. I won't attempt to sing it, A, because I don't know all the words, and B, because my voice wouldn't stand it. But I think you know the song, which was already in circulation in the Royal Navy by this period. And again, for a sailor's grave, cheer up, brave lads, 'tis to glory we steer is an obvious reference to have at the top of the stone, where you have the references to immortality and the life to come and so on. And then to stick the man's ship in there as well is a very clever touch. Notice, by the way, a very specific detail that on the mizzenmast you have a gaff and boom sail, which is correct. This is late 18th century, so you should have a gaff and boom, not a lateen sail, and we'll see that again later. Jane Austen mentions in Mansfield Park how particular sailors are about representations of ships. So if you were doing a gravestone for a sea captain, you must get his ship right, or he will be very, very angry with you. You've got to get the technical detail right. And so the mason, who is definitely a bit better than average here, has taken the trouble to put the right kind of sail onto the mizzenmast of this man's ship. That number is a later addition, by the way. There are various attempts to number the graves and the plots at various times in the history of Greyfriars. None of them really work. Happy chaos is what it really wants to be, and is what it always reverts to, as all burial grounds do. Variations on this is a MK for Mackenzie, Clan Mackenzie, so the Stag's Head crest. Usual things, winged soul above, rather an angular sort of winged soul with swept forward wings, and the usual things at the bottom. But the inscription above the skull and crossbones is a slight variation. It's not memento mori, as we shall see, it's disce mori. And you get that occasionally, disce mori, meaning learn to die, which again is a rather odd thing to say, but sort of makes sense when you think about it. And in case your Latin's a bit rusty, this particular little gravestone actually has it in English. At the top, the winged soul. In the middle, I'm afraid everything's delaminating and falling off, which is one of the problems with Perth sandstone. And at the bottom, I think you can just make out the beginnings of the word learn there. So learn to die rather than memento mori. Meaning, and of course, what it really means by learn to die, meaning learn to die well, learn to deal with death, learn to come to terms with it. Not, I mean, just doing it is not what they mean. They mean dealing with it at a more sort of philosophical level. And there we are, of course. Blair is picking up the same thing. Never to think of death and of ourselves at the same time, as if to learn to die were no concern of ours, oh more than sottish. And on he goes, there he is. So again, that conversation between the poet and the gravestones, and each picking up from the other, this cultural conversation. At the bottom, how the proud prince, the thought that everybody, even the most dignified, even the most prosperous, in the end have to deal with this, brings me to another little theme in Greyfriars. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but some may not be. The Farker Mausoleum at the entrance to Greyfriars. Before I get to it, just to point out, of course, that the building behind is sheltered housing, and we have that's Quayside Court, and we have this wonderful tradition in Perth of building sheltered housing and care homes either on top of or directly adjacent to burial grounds, just so as to cheer up the residents. But in this particular case, this is the mausoleum of Major General William Farker, who was in the Madras Engineer Corps, who spent some of his time as resident in Malacca, which I think is now part of Indonesia, and afterwards at Singapore, which later settlement he founded. So we have in Perth the founder or one of the founders of the modern city-state of Singapore, who, and we more or less, unless you go into that graveyard or know about these things, I wonder how many people know that we have someone as distinguished as that buried in Greyfriars Burial Ground. I wonder if the people of Singapore are aware that the founder of their city-state is buried here in Perth. It's interesting, and this is not Greyfriars, of course. This is, of course, Canoe, and this is, of course, Millais and Effie Chalmers Gray. As you move from the 18th century into the 19th century, you tend to see, I think, a little bit more in the way of social stratification in Perth, in terms of gravestones, that you get the very elaborate, the very formal, and the quite grand, and the Millais and Gray, that they're quite a respected family in Perth, but long settled, and so their gravestone is quite grand. And of course, it happens that the Millais family become important members and benefactors of our society, and some of the books in our library collection were given by members of that family. So we have a family connection with the Millais and the Greys. Crafts and professions are a big thing in 18th century burial grounds, more so than the 19th. In the 19th century, and as the century wears on, it's more and more about names and dates and family connections of who is your auntie and so on, and then expressions of sentiment. But in the 18th century, it's very much about what you do, because the craft guilds are so important. And very often, when you're in these 18th century burial grounds, it feels like a meeting of the Chamber of Commerce that's just gone on for a long time. The vision of the life to come is like a Rotary Club meeting, that you are there very much as a representative of your craft in amongst your peers. There's the community of the borough, which is a big thing in medieval and early modern Scottish boroughs, carries on into the graveyard. You are very much there amongst friends, or possibly friends, or maybe enemies in some cases, but you knew each other anyway. And that's very much how it's done. And so the representation of crafts and professions is quite a big thing on the stones. This is a gardener's stone. And again, this idea of taking traditional themes and the traditional forms of a gravestone, but adapting them in clever ways. So at the top, under the winged stone, you have a principio, because from the beginning the Lord created the heavens and the earth. So you have the globe of the earth down here, and you have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and in the middle you have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, with a serpent wound around the trunk, and Adam and Eve reaching out towards the forbidden fruit, which they probably shouldn't have done. And down at the bottom, you have the gardener's implements. You have a reel, and they don't have a spirit level. They have a sort of wooden balance type thing, almost like a weighing scales that they use for leveling up, and pegs and flags and so on. All the apparatus of an ornamental gardener. And then at the bottom, of course, you have the usual disconnected bone, skull, and hourglass. Here, the hourglass is horizontal rather than vertical because, of course, time has ceased to run for this person, so the clock has stopped. And you often see that on gravestones. It's quite clever the way it's done to adapt those themes so that they make sense. You've got the man's profession in the middle, but connecting in these subtle ways with a spiritual theme at the top and an earthly theme at the bottom. And of course, because cultivating the earth is what he does. So naturally, the gardener's tools are at the bottom of the earth because that's where they should be. And the tree is growing, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is growing out of the top. Or is it the tree of knowledge, or is it the tree of life? It's so interesting the way the symbolism is kind of interwoven and slightly fluid at the edges, and that's quite deliberate. It's become even more fluid with the passage of time because the red sandstone has weathered a bit, and it's becoming harder to work out which one is Adam and which one is Eve as time goes on, as the odd bits and pieces fall off, I'm afraid to say, with the passage of time. That's the reverse of the stone, giving the date of 1782 and telling us that he was a gardener. And across the river in Kinfauns, you have another gardener's stone of essentially the same design, the same choice of very bright red sandstone as well. Less weathered because there's less air pollution over in Kinfauns. Up Principio at the top, all the same things. Adam and Eve looking a little bit more recognizable in this one. And on the back, it's exactly the same date, 1782. So there were obviously two gardeners in and around Perth who came to the end of their time in 1782. And while we're on a gardening theme, I point out the wonderful growth of lichen on the stone. That's of some scientific interest, actually, that with gravestones, where you have growth of lichen, because you have a date, you actually know the time at which that lichen growth began. And lichens grow in very complicated ways. They spread, and you have successions of slightly different variations of lichen as the colony ages and develops. So from a botanical point of view, it's of great interest to have gravestones as very conveniently dated experiments in the growth of lichen on different materials. Which is one of the reasons that quite apart from the fact that you'll destroy them, it's one of the reasons that you shouldn't over-aggressively clean gravestones, is that the lichen growth on them is of actual scientific interest in its own right. Resurrection, not Perth, obviously. This is obviously St Mary's Chapel, Grantley. It's the painted ceiling, which I put up because I couldn't resist it, because we don't get, as I've said before, we don't get a lot of resurrection type themes in Perth. It's not a big thing. Whereas doom paintings, where you have the resurrection and the Last Judgment, are quite a common theme in churches in England. And St Mary's Grantley is a fascinating example in Scotland of vernacular art showing these rather wonderful angels of the resurrection with their trumpets and the cloud with a silver lining, and the dead rising from their graves. This man seems to have found an extra head that no one wants, and he's looking around to see if anybody would like it. There's this rather nubile young lady being resurrected here who's attracting a great deal of attention from the people on either side of her, one obviously fascinated and the other rather disapproving. So I think there's a village story being told in this particular scene. It's not quite sure why this is here. Someone on a bed and with death coming to visit him with his dart, the skeletal figure with the dart in hand. That's a traditional theme as well, which pops up a lot in Scottish vernacular art of the time. This is from the 1600s, but shows you what the sort of the artistic tradition is. I flag it up as an aside because, of course, those of you who know the work of Stanley Spencer, that eccentric and interesting English artist of the 20th century, who, of course, did the famous Cookham Resurrection paintings and the War Memorial Chapel in Hampshire, but also spent a lot of time during the Second World War on the Clyde doing paintings of work in the shipyards. So did come to Scotland as a war artist, and might even have seen this particular example here in front of us. I often like to believe that some of Stanley Spencer's resurrection paintings, which have this intentionally naive look to them, might have owed something to this sort of representation we see here, but which in a way we see on some of the stones. Here is Blake's version of the resurrection, a little bit crowded actually, a bit dark and gloomy. In a way, I think I prefer the Grantley version of it. And here's Blair's meditations on the thought, the promised day of restitution, when loud diffusive sound from brazen trump of strong-lunged cherub shall alarm thy captives and rouse the long sleepers into life, daylight and liberty. That is Blake's interpretation of those lines. As I said before, if you let a man like Blake loose on this sort of symbolism, you know that he's going to run away with it. I mean, this is Salvador Dali, really, isn't it? This is an absolutely surrealistic take on the resurrection, with this inverted angel blasting away on his trumpet. And it really is a strong-lunged cherub. Well, cherub, by the way, as an aside, an important one, sometimes in later art history is taken to mean what the Italians call putti, these sort of winged baby faces. But it's actually a good Hebrew and I think Persian word, cherub, meaning a griffin. A real cherub is something a lot more formidable than a baby face and a pair of wings. And so the angels of the resurrection, as Blake quite rightly understands, are really quite vigorous and energetic sort of chaps. And very correctly, he has given us a burial, not in a coffin, but in a shroud, because that was the majority arrangement. Most people were buried in shrouds. Coffins were a bit of a luxury. Most of the burials that we've excavated on various sites in Scotland are shroud burials, not coffin burials. And the good thing about being buried in a shroud is it's much easier to sit up, as this particular individual is doing in response to the angel of the resurrection. So this is Blake, in the spirit of Salvador Dali, taking the concept of resurrection to its absolute limit. This is the same thing in Cooper Angus, and the same riotous muddle of symbols, that you have a skeleton in the middle, which could be the dead person, or it could be the personification of death itself, because he has a downward pointing dart. And you have the angels of the resurrection in stereo, giving it loudly on either side of him. And then down the bottom, you have the usual symbols of, that looks like beer, a pallet for carrying a coffin. The coffin is right next to it. Yes, there's the coffin. Skull and crossbones, a bell, a very large bell, and a shovel and spade. That stone is now lost, actually. I think it's disintegrated. So some years ago, I photographed that in Cooper Angus. It doesn't quite, it's a bit more randomized than the Greyfriars stones are. It's a bit more modeled, whereas the Greyfriars stones follow the rules of how to lay out a gravestone quite strictly. Out of town, they tend to be a bit more sort of making up as they go along. But the results are interesting. And while we're on the theme of resurrection, of course, that stone used to be leaning up against this building here, which is a watch house, because you have the other sort of resurrection in 18th and 19th century Scotland, the Burke and Hare tradition of the resurrectionists body snatching. And so in a lot of Scottish graveyards, you see these little buildings so that you can pay somebody to sit there all night and watch and stop people digging up your nearest and dearest to take them to the medical schools for classes in anatomy. The other way of solving the same problem is the Mort House, which is to put the body in a very secure building like this one here, which is again at Couperingus, and leave it there until it's past the stage at which you can sell it. So when it's gone well past its best before date, then you bury it, and that way you defeat the resurrectionists, as they were ironically called. This is the Mort House at Kinfauns, somewhat smaller, but a lot of Scottish graveyards have them. Another view of the Couperingus Mort House. You can see how it's designed almost like a World War II pillbox, with windows looking at the polygonal plan, with the windows looking all round, minus the machine guns that you would have in World War II, but with the idea that your watchman, if he's awake and sober, will see the surreptitious grave robbers digging up your relatives. And the other way of dealing with it, of course, is the famous concept of the Mort safe. Here, the famous examples in wrought iron at Logierate. And as we see, one size does not fit all. And these sort of things, like the slip coffin and the Mort cloth, you could hire from the parish. And so the parish poor fund would partly be supplemented by the fees for hiring the parish Mort safe and others, and the parish Mort cloth and so on. The hearse was sometimes parish property as well and could be hired, and again the proceeds would go to supplement the parish poor fund. So that it's very much that sense of all the arrangements around burial and funerals and so on being very much collective, very much part of the parish life, very much this community that you live in and die in and are buried in. And there are expectations of what's decent, what's appropriate, what's expected. And people have quite, perhaps voluntarily, but perhaps also involuntarily, there are pressures to conform and follow a pattern. You're not alone, but you don't have much privacy either. That's the rule of that sort of community. Coming to the end of Blair's poem, he picks up the theme of the winged soul in a way, comparing the human soul and the human body to a bird. Thus at shut of even, the weary bird leaves the wide air and in some lonely brake cowers down and dozes till the dawn of day, then claps his well-fledged wings and bears away. The end, which is a very appropriate way of finishing a poem on this subject. That's Blair's sort of cross-reference to the winged soul concept, which gives me an excuse to bring in this, again, not a Perth stone. This is from Fortingall, and I rather like it because of the exceptionally well-fledged wings provided for this particular winged soul. And if we see at the top here, those are particularly well-developed wings. You'll notice it's not in sandstone, it's green micaceous schist, which is the local stone up in Glen Lyon and in Aberfeldy and so on, which weathers much better than the sandstone that we have in Perth, and also much less air pollution up there, so the stones do better. A rather nice stone indeed, but picks up a number of themes. Below the winged soul, we have this big oval cartouche. That's where you could have symbolism of a person's life, but here it's blank. And not because the person had a blank life, but because the person chose not to have that particular bit engraved. My point being that to some extent, the stones are prefabricated. There were catalogues of people like Quarles had catalogues of symbolism that you could use on gravestones. Your better class of monumental mason would have blanks ready made. And so when you were ordering a gravestone, and you would probably order it well in advance, it's something you would think about if you had the sort of resources to have one. Mm-hmm. To some extent, you're picking from within a repertoire. You can ask for something special, or you can go with the normal menu. And so when you're reading the gravestones, when you're imbibing them, as it were, it's an interesting question to ask yourself: to what extent is this what people actually think and feel and believe? And what extent is it, this is what's expected? But what is the difference? I mean, I once had an interesting experience of attending a funeral of someone, or with someone next to me who knew that they were going to be organizing a funeral in the near future, was talking about this very problem of, you know, how much do you go with convention, how much do you do something particular, and up to a point, convention's okay. You know, that you don't want to stun everybody at a funeral, really. So that prefabrication thing is interesting. Rather nicely carved hourglass, skull and crossbones and coffin. But can I draw your attention to this bit in the middle, just there, that where you might expect the Latin memento mori, remember death, instead you have Koinyachamas, which is Gaelic for remember death. So that's very interesting. That's definitely personalizing a stone. It's interesting that in Fortingall in the 18th century, you have people who were wealthy enough to order a stone like this, which wouldn't have been cheap, but who choose to identify as Gaelic speakers. And that's interesting to know. Interesting to know that Gaelic speakers are in the respectable classes up in Fortingall, up in that and in northern Perthshire. And that shouldn't surprise us too much because, of course, the Black Watch, the independent companies of the Watch, begins as a volunteer militia in northern Perthshire of Gaelic speakers who are nevertheless loyal to the government and respectable. So that's an interesting piece of evidence of how the culture works in our own area. Resurrection, I think we were talking about earlier, and stones and so on. This is a nice stone from Perth. It's unusual in that below the winged soul you have some words. We don't normally do that in Perth. In Deus solo spes mea, in God alone is my hope. But again, it's following the rules. If you want to say something hopeful, you put it at the top along with the winged soul. And then at the bottom, where you don't want to be so hopeful, when there's the skull and there's the crossbones, memento mori, remember death. And in case your Latin's a bit rusty, time how short, eternity how long, to kind of drive the message home. So that it's the deliberate, and then heraldic devices in the middle. So it's following the rules, but adding a bit extra. And that carries on into the 19th century. In the earlier part of the 19th century, you get a sort of a classicizing tendency, in this case Roman classical, with a nice Roman pediment and Roman columns and so on. And we're quite a long distance now from skull and crossbones and winged souls, but in Christos solus salus, salvation in Christ alone, naturally goes at the top, not at the bottom of the stone, because that's meant to be hopeful, so it goes at the top. At the late 18th century, John Wesley came to Perth. I think I mentioned this before. He came to Perth and went away in despair and said that the Lord will never do anything in a place like Perth. I think he found us all a little bit sort of uptight and a bit stiff. And it's very much of the Perth thing that if you're going to say something at all positive and cheerful, you'll probably say it in Latin. And it's quite noticeable as well that you don't get the mention of Christ is very, very rare in Greyfriars. If you go to the Howth in Dundee, there are lots of Christian texts and lots of explicitly Christian references. In Perth, in the 18th century, and even into the 19th, it would be quite hard to prove that the people buried here were actually Christians. They probably were, but it's not the sort of thing you talk about in polite company. And that's a very Perth way of doing things. And so if you're going to mention anything explicitly Christian, naturally you do it in Latin. And even then you don't do it very often, not in Greyfriars. This is an interesting thing in the same direction. The broken classical column becomes a traditional artistic symbol of, certainly as you go into the early 19th century, a thing to have in graveyards, with of course the Hellenistic Greek meander pattern at the top. And then at the bottom, rather than an explicitly religious text, you have this something more sort of quotation marks spiritual. in a very general and sort of uncertain sort of way. I'll be often with you when you think I'm far away. I think that's meant to be hopeful rather than a threat, but that's more what you get in Perth, and certainly that's the sort of thing you start to see more of, along with Masonic symbols, as you move. Masonic, as in speculative Masons, not actual operative Masons. That's the kind of thing you start to see more of, and a kind of generalized spirituality as you move into the 19th century. You occasionally get something a bit more expressing of feeling and more explicitly Christian, as in this little verse here on the back of a gravestone, 1851. Now we're into the Victorian period. Again, with quite a classical sort of form and structure. We haven't gone Gothic yet. That comes a bit later. That at this period, classical is the thing to do. Another classical sort of stone. The stone itself is something has gone wrong here. I think some kind of coating might have been put on the stone very early on and has started to spoil off. And this stone is almost illegible now because of the decay, which is a pity. Nice classical pediment at the top. And if you look closely at the top, you may have trouble reading the inscription because it is, of course, in Greek, speiretai en athenia, which means it is sown in dishonor. That's where it comes from. 1 Corinthians 15:42 to 43. It's a wonderful text, very appropriate for the top of a gravestone. If you're going to do resurrection themes, obviously you put them at the top. And it's a fascinating discussion of what does resurrection mean for Christians? What is it about? Is it like dragging bodies out of the grave? No, not exactly. But something is happening. It is sown in corruption, it's raised in incorruption. It's sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it's raised in power. It's a wonderful text. You could preach on it for an hour, and I've done that in a different context. But what's fascinating is, of course, that in Perth, it's done in Greek. You don't put things like that in English, not in Perth. But in Kinfauns, they go even one better. In a very similar stone at the top, the inscription is in Hebrew, just to make absolutely sure that no one will understand it. And it turns out that it says in Hebrew, "I know that my Redeemer liveth," a quotation from the prophet Job, set to music by Handel, of course, in the Messiah. So wonderfully appropriate for a hopeful thing at the top of a gravestone. But the number of native speakers of Hebrew in Kinfauns in the 19th century was probably quite small. But that's the kind of thing we do. As you move towards, out of the 18th century into the 19th century, you see the difference in flavor. If you look here, for example, this is your 18th century stone that we're familiar with now, with a skull and crossbones, winged soul, pub sign technology in the way it's made. Move over here and you are into the early 19th century, or even middle 19th century, and we are in a different world completely. There, you don't express emotion of any kind on 18th century stones. It's a kind of severity that's intentional. And partly, I think, a way of dealing with the ever-present fact of death. Move over to here, and you are in a different world completely, with the sarcophagus and the mourner draped over it. This is actually the grave of a minister who died rather young, born in St. Meadows, and who died as a very young man as a minister of the West Church in Perth. And here, of course, is Robert Blair on the same theme. The new made widow, too, I've sometimes spied. Sad sight, slow moving o'er the prostrate dead. Listless she crawls along in doleful black, while bursts of sorrow gush from either eye. So it's hard to know. Has someone been reading Blair and decided to have this stone made? Well, they would have been reading Blair. It's a minister's gravestone, and any minister of that period would have read Robert Blair's poem. I mean, you did. And the people in the congregation who collected to build it, to have this stone made for him, they would have read it as well. But this is high art. I mean, this is someone trained in Italy. This is very expensive sculpture, totally different from the pub sign technology of the 18th century, and totally different from pub sign severity. And Blair is sort of documenting the change. Some of Blair has one foot in the 18th century, but he's anticipating the sort of much more expressive and personal kind of thing that you're going to get in the 19th century. As a footnote, of course, the Scottish Widows Insurance Company was originally founded to provide pensions for the widows of Church of Scotland ministers. So that's its origins. It diversified over the years, but it began specifically to provide pensions for ministers' widows. And so how appropriate that the idea of the Scottish widow is a huge cultural thing in Blair, and there she is, connected with the Scottish minister. The cultural conversation continues. And it continues even to the railings. Those are 20th century railings installed by Mike Messenger in mild steel, but to replicate the wrought iron railings that were around all of the better quality monuments along that side of the graveyard. As you move into, whereas in the 18th century, there's a lot of jumble and confusion in graveyards. The Victorians like tidiness, and they like to suburbanize death. They like to domesticate it. And so you get all these railings, which are then, of course, taken away during World War II, because Max Aitken, as a propaganda stunt, tries to get people to collect up wrought iron railings to make battleships out of, which they weren't suitable for, of course, at all. But that was the idea that he had. But it was a nice thought to reinstate them, just to remind people of what the burial ground was like as you move into the 19th century. And all the detail matters, the pine cones, because of course, pine being evergreen, symbol of eternal life, and also a tradition of pine cones as aromatic fuel on cremation altars in classical times and so on. All the detail has meaning in these things. Even the shelter, by the way, that Mike Messenger designed, it looks like a railway canopy, which is appropriate with the railway next door. But the height of it's deliberate. It's so high that when the trees are in leaf, you don't even see it. It just vanishes into the tree canopy and has the minimum intrusion in protecting these stones that have been gathered at the south end and have been conserved. Because the stones like this Glover stone were in a bad way, they were delaminating, they were turning back into dust. And this Glover stone here, as you can see, delaminating, and we're losing the face of it. That's the famous Bisset stone before it was cleaned, all covered in soot and various oxides. There it is again. That's how it looks today. The art of cleaning the stones is there's a lady named Graciela Ainsworth who specializes in this for Scottish gravestones, applying various lime poultices and so on, because obviously you can't just pressure wash a sandstone tombstone or it would just dissolve. There's a tremendous amount of work goes into stabilizing it and cleaning it. And it's no surprise that the Bisset stone, another sea captain stone, was selected. Note all the detail, as well as the man's ship in the place in the middle where you expect his ordinary life. You've got the skull and crossbones at the bottom. You've got some symbols at the top that we'll come to in a minute. The torch, upright torches burning, inverted torches extinguished, symbol of death, symbol of life. On the ship, you have the anchor, because of course the hope and anchor, the anchor is a symbol of hope based on another quotation of St. Paul. And on the other side, the rather lovely, rather contented looking winged soul at the top, and a little poem. Here you have the usual skull and crossbones, and on either side you have these little skeletons, and they sort of belong here along with the initials of all the people. Are they symbols of death? Are you meant to be scared of them, or are they almost like little guardians? Are we domesticating death here? Is that part of the 18th century idea that by representing death in this way, you're sort of taming it? Rather like the South American custom in places like Mexico, for these customs for Halloween, where you almost make a carnival out of death as a way of coming to terms with it. That death grins at you and you grin back. There's some interesting things going on there. Friendly little chaps, aren't they, in their way? And there's his ship. Now, Captain Bisset would have been quite fussy about his ship as well. And so he's got a lateen sail. This is slightly earlier in the 18th century. So here we have a lateen sail on the mizzenmast, and because the transition from lateen to gaff and boom happens in the 18th century. If I remember rightly, Nelson's Victory, when it was first built, had a lateen sail on the mizzen. And by the time of Trafalgar, that had been refitted with a gaff and boom, which was easier to use. But you have to get these things right when a sea captain is your customer. And there's the anchor as the symbol of hope up on the mainmast. And down below, you have some sailors with their sea boots on and a compass rose in the middle, so we know where we're going. And an anchor as a symbol of hope. And one of them has got a little clay pipe in his mouth. So again, the importance of tobacco in the life to come, as far as Perth citizens are concerned. That says Deo, so I would guess that the rest of that is probably Soli Deo Gloria, glory to God alone. Little angel of the resurrection up at the top. Of course, he goes up at the top with his trumpet. And because Bissett is a sea captain, you remember that there are three things that are wonderful in the book of Proverbs: the way of a ship on the sea, or the way of a serpent on a rock, and the way of a ship upon the sea. So we've got a serpent. He's biting his tail because that's "in my end is my beginning," which is a symbol of immortality. And snakes are symbols of immortality as well, because they cast their skins and regenerate themselves. I think Mary Queen of Scots, one of her embroideries is a serpent biting its tail with the saying, "In my end is my beginning." So, again, encircling the monogram here, if you did chemistry at school, you might remember that Kekule solved the mystery of the ring structure of benzene after he had a dream of serpents biting their tails. And with the right organic molecules, you can have, if you stick them in your pipe, you can have all sorts of interesting dreams. And so it's very appropriate that we have, as it were, this ancient symbol. And Kekule, although he would have been very familiar with this symbol as well. The serpent biting its tail is a long established symbol. I think there are roses on this stone tucked away as well, roses of paradise, because of course the rose is the symbol of paradise in Persian tradition. Every kind of mythology and symbolism gets layered onto these stones. As we leave Greyfriars, because we are running out of time, that is the appropriate theme, which is why we have to leave Greyfriars. And at the portal, as we leave, we are being reminded that we are running out of time. We have a sundial, and above it, this wonderfully naturalistic skull with the two hourglasses on either side. This rather crumpled scroll here reads Memento Mori and Fugit Ora, the hour flies, to remind us. And as we leave, we're in a minority. We have the privilege of leaving the graveyard. Not everyone can. And so we're being reminded to prepare ourselves, and also reminded that leaving is a privilege. We mustn't waste it. Time is precious and should be used well. That's the same, and that of course is Blake's take on the same thing, the portal theme. Tis with this, and because it's Blake, naturally he put something rather strange at the top. "'Tis but a night, a long and moonless night, we make the grave our bed and then are gone," says Blair. And on that theme, I will stop and let you gather your breath and see what you make of Greyfriars. I will see if I can come back, if I can get myself back to seeing the screen. I'll stop sharing, yes, so I can now see everybody again. I imagine some people might have some questions or some comments, and I'll do my best to make up an answer. Margaret, yes.
David, two things. I thought that the horizontal and vertical egg timers, what do I
Yes,
mean?
hourglasses.
Hourglasses,
Yes,
that it depended on the person's age, if he was under 60 or over 60.
that's
I
interesting.
can't remember which was which.
I hadn't heard that before, but that's interesting that the thought that perhaps the sand hadn't run out but had been stopped prematurely.
Good idea. Yeah.
That would make sense. No, I hadn't heard that one before, but it could well be right. That whether, if one looked very closely, one could perhaps see whether there was any sand left in the glass or not. But yes, it would make sense.
Yes, I must sort of look into that. It's and the other thing that intrigues me is usually in graveyards, the gravestones who still have the railings are either ministers or the gentry.
Yes.
And kind of ordinary folk don't have railings round their graves.
Yes.
In the Victorian age, would anyone have had railings? Or
that's an interesting question. I think probably the railings of the more distinguished persons have survived the depredations of Lord Beaverbrook in World War II.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Max Aitken, but also, that putting up railings is very much an expensive thing to do.
Yes.
That you're defining a family plot rather than allowing yourself to be squeezed in next to your neighbours. So only a minority of people would be able to afford the expense of an exclusive plot defined by railings.
I see. Yes. Yes.
But so there's definitely a social stratification involved.
David, I've got two questions on chat. One's from Colin MacLeod.
Yes.
And the other's from Francis. So
yes.
With Colin's first. He says, sometimes in English churchyards, we see memorials commissioned by the deceased while they were still alive. The date of death may have been added later in a different font, and occasionally there is just a vacant space where the date of death wasn't added, ! Is there any evidence of this happening in Perth?
There may well be. I suspect that many of the stones would have been commissioned by someone during their lifetime. I haven't noticed the case of a missing date to confirm that. I've heard it said, and I've read in various places, that there was a tradition that one of the first tasks that a respectable young woman was expected to do on her marriage was to prepare shrouds for all her family, so that they would be in readiness when they were needed. It was, there's nothing like thinking ahead. And so collecting linen shrouds so that you could be wrapped up decently when the time came, it was a thing that mattered to people, and you were expected to prepare ahead. So that may well have happened. But I don't know, I can't confirm Colin's observation, but I haven't looked closely enough to see as to whether there are obvious cases where the stone must have been commissioned by the person that's now under it. But I think that'll probably be quite common. And
then Francis's question.
Yes.
Does being an archaeologist make you fear dying?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because I remember having a conversation with Derek Hall, who's going to be speaking to us later in the month, that I'd read somewhere that one of the signs of being depressed is that you think a lot about death. And Derek and I were looking at each other because in our office, we had 360 skeletons in crates stacked up. And so we were thinking, well, in the circumstances, we sort of can't help thinking about death. It doesn't mean that we're depressed. It's just the way things are in our job that you do think about it. I don't know if it makes you afraid of dying, but it makes you aware of it, or it ought to. It certainly, I can't think what else would serve so well to make you at least reflect on the fact that we're not in this world forever. That digging up skeletons is definitely going to fix that thought in your mind. And for 18th century people, the ordinary daily experience of their lives made them think of this anyway. So in a way, I suppose archaeologists, as in so many departments of life, archaeologists may be out of tune with the present and deeply in touch with the past, that our way of life somehow puts us on the same wavelength as those people of a century ago, just because of what we do. Although, of course, suddenly we've come back into fashion. The last year has suddenly made the 18th century view of the world much closer to home for everybody.
Well, very good. Tom has a question for you.
David,
yes.
you talked about the layout of the symbols on the gravestones.
Yes.
That was really interesting. And is that a local thing, or is that same layout seen, say, nationally all over Scotland, or is that a kind of global convention at the time for layout?
It is conventional, and you see it all over Scotland and probably farther south as well. But it's followed with varying degrees of rigor. That in Perth, or specifically in Greyfriars, they like to do things by the book. And there was a book written by a chap named Quarles. And so they like to do things in quite an ordered way, and the stones seem to follow the rules quite clearly. Whereas sometimes when you get out into the countryside, you see odd variations. I remember seeing a stone out in Dumfries and Galloway somewhere where the hourglass and the coffin had been combined together to make something like a cruise missile and placed at the top of the stone rather than the bottom. It was most weird. The hourglass was horizontal and the coffin was horizontal joined onto it, and it was sort of flying across the top of the stone. You wouldn't see that in Greyfriars.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's finished.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, David. Can you hear me?
I can, Gordon, yes.
We have a question, my wife and I. On your, have you discovered anything about what happened to the stones that Cromwell used to build his citadel? And were they returned somehow or other after the citadel was demolished?
When it's complicated, because we excavated in the South Inch, we excavated the site of the citadel and found quite a lot of the stone walls, because the nature of an artillery fortification is that a lot of it is below ground level to have minimal exposure to enemy gunfire. So a lot of the structure of the fort is down there still. What happened was that the citadel was never formally demolished. It was granted to the citizens of Perth as a sort of compensation for the depredations of Cromwell's time, along the basis, well, it's a pity Cromwell smashed your town up. You can have the stones if you want them. And so it was demolished piecemeal over several hundred years, and so was still usable in both of the Jacobite uprisings.
Yep.
It was still semi-usable. So stones were pulled out and could have finished up anywhere. Who knows what became of them? I don't think there was, as far as I know, a settled pattern of deliberately bringing them back to Greyfriars, and not all of them have been taken. They could turn up in garden walls, they could turn up upside down in people's gardens, forming pavements. Any older structures in Perth that are made of sandstone rubble, if you dismantled them, you might find fragments of gravestones.
Oh, that's interesting.
You never know where they will turn up.
Where was the citadel anyway?
Thank you, David.
Yes, Cromwell's citadel was on the South Inch, a little bit south. it's sort of south of where the car park is. It's in that kind of area. If you look at Rutherford 1774, which is quite a good, well-surveyed map of Perth, that shows the Citadel already in quite a state of decay. If you look at Pettit 1715, that shows the Citadel as refurbished during the Jacobite Rising. And so you can work out from that where it was. We excavated it in advance of some works, I think, that were done for Scottish Water back about 20, 30 years ago now. And that's published in one of the Taffak volumes. I can't remember which one. So if you look up the Tayside of Life Archaeological Journal, which is free online at the Taffak website, eventually you'll find Mike Roy's article on the excavations of the Citadel, what we found and where the Citadel was and so on. But you know, the structure is very substantial and a lot of it's down there.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Could I ask a question? I was just wondering, it seemed that in the 18th century, social distinctions didn't seem to be as great as in the 19th. You had a captain's gravestone, which was bigger than a gardener's, but not hugely, and it was obviously it was more elaborate. I just wondering, is that a correct impression that perhaps people were less ostentatious, or was it maybe that the more distinguished were buried elsewhere?
It's an interesting thing. The very distinguished would have been buried elsewhere. They would have had private mausoleums in the parish churches out in the country near to where they lived. Or in the case of the super distinguished, like the first Earl of Mansfield, he is buried in one of the transepts of Westminster Abbey. And if you have seen his grave, it is like an enormous macabre cuckoo clock with a life-size skeleton leaping out of doors at the top of it. The first Earl of Mansfield. The first Earl of Mansfield, who was educated at Westminster College and therefore has the connection with Westminster Abbey, and of course spent a lot of his working life in London. He is that's about as distinguished as you get anywhere near Perth, and Westminster Abbey is about as distinguished a place to be buried as you can find. So yes, at the very top end, you know, the Earls of Perth, the Earls of Canoe and so on, they wouldn't be buried in Greyfriars. They would have their own private arrangements. The Greyfriars is really for the people who live in Perth, the citizens of Perth. The desperately poor wouldn't have gravestones at all. I mean, you know, physical monuments are kind of a luxury. And for the people who live in Perth, the members of the various crafts and the business people and so on, there is stratification of wealth, but it's not huge. If you are hugely wealthy, you move out of Perth. You buy somewhere out in the country, and you commute, or you end up living in London or something in much more famous circumstances. So it's the community that's buried in Greyfriars is, as it were, pre-selected. It's the people who are rich enough to have gravestone, but not so rich as to be buried somewhere else. And that, I think, sets a kind of limit. But it's an interesting limit because it does reinforce that sense that within a Scottish borough, you have this sense of a community of the respectable, and the respectable but not fantastically wealthy people. And their community goes on beyond into the grave, as it were. Yes.
But that doesn't carry on in the 19th century, though.
In the 19th century, of course, as you get later on in the 19th century, two things happen. One, you get the stones are more individualistic, and they get bigger. The 19th century monuments tend to be quite a bit larger. And of course, you get the new cemetery opens at Wells Hill. And so people start to be buried there. And so Greyfriars gradually fills up. The last burials are in Greyfriars are in the 1970s of individuals who had family plots. but they're very rare. There's not many people get buried in Greyfriars after the 19th century, and Wells Hill becomes the default setting, as it were.
David, Francis has got a question, I think. Do you, Francis? Francis?
It's on the chat, isn't it? Probably.
Yeah. Have you got that? She's asking.
Yes.
Basically.
Yes. Yes. We toured a Perth. Yes, indeed. I've done them many a time and oft, and can do them again once we're allowed to do that. In fact, if the restrictions were partially lifted, I was going to go around with Tom and do a video tour that we could put online. But yes, we could certainly do some more tours of Perth for the society once we're allowed to do that sort of thing again. But, yes. And I think, yes, people have found a bit more about, yes, Eva's reminding us that Mike Roy's article isn't digitized yet, isn't online yet, but it is in various places. I think it should be in, when the library opens again, they'll have a volume of it as well. So you can look up Mike Roy's excavations if you want to know where the Citadel is on the South Inch. Any other questions? I'm just saying, I'm trying to see what's on the chat column here without accidentally closing it. Yes. Some of them I answered already. Yes. Yes.
Eva's drawing attention to Derek Hall's talk on the 17th.
That's right, yes, and that will be well worth hearing, because Derek Hall's been digging in Perth longer than I have, and so there's a lot of overlap in what we say. Derek will be able to give his own particular take on things as well. So do tune in on the 17th. Yes. Someone else is going to ask something?
How to do this.
Just if you unmute yourself, you can. Then you should just be able to ask your question. If you,
Yeah.
Yes.
Anything else you want to ask?
I don't think so. It was interesting.
Yes, good. Someone was. I think someone was.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, does the Greyfriars Cemetery have closing times? Is it open to individuals anytime?
In normal times, it's open during the day and locked at night.
The oldest.
In normal times.
Right.
At the moment, I think it is locked up. On the occasions when I've given guided walks around it, I've arranged to get a key from the council so that we don't all get locked in by mistake.
I understand. Yes.
But in normal times, it's open anyway during the daytime. When
Okay.
Mike Messenger refurbished the place all those years ago, one of the things he did was to create a second entrance at Tay Street. And that was quite clever. The idea was he wanted it to, whereas it only had one way in and out, from the car park opposite in Canal Street.
Yeah.
By making it a through pathway, he wanted it to be so that people could walk in knowing that they could get out again, which is very symbolic, because a lot of the street drinkers tended to hang out in the burial ground. And though they don't harm anybody, if you go in there, you might be a bit anxious if you're in there and the street drinkers are all gathered around the entrance and you feel like you kind of have to confront them. In my own experience, they've become quite proprietorial about the place. I remember I was doing a talk once in the graveyard and one of the street drinkers, a female street drinker, came up and put her arms around me and kissed me and thanked me for doing it, which was, well, it's nice to be appreciated. And so they seem to be, fairly, as street drinkers go, they're fairly sort of culturally sensitive street drinkers. Mm-hmm. But Mike Messenger's thought of having two entrances so that it would feel like a safer place to be in was quite a clever one, because you don't want to be locked in there. But at the moment it is, I think at the moment it's locked up because of the various restrictions.
It's locked up.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it will reopen.
Francis has another question for you.
Yes, far away. Yes. Symbols I would like on my gravestone. Yes. I would be tempted to take the 18th century traditions and vary them a little bit. So perhaps at the bottom, rather than having a skull and crossbones, how about an hourglass and a pair of dodos? That would make the same point in a more sort of subtle way. Yes, I haven't finished the design yet, but I can think of. I suppose in the middle, I want to have a trowel and a shovel and a spade to signify the things that I do in life.
It's a symbol for a scientist.
Yes, well, I suppose for a scientist, you might have some test tubes or something, or something of that sort. But for me as an archaeologist, a trowel is the obvious thing. Yes, I have to think about that. But I like the idea of a pair of dodos facing into an hourglass.
Here's another question, David.
Yes.
Have you any information on the oldest gravestone found in Perth?
There is the very old gravestone at the back of Greyfriars, the Buchan stone, which goes right back to the 1580s. And that must be about the oldest surviving stone in Greyfriars, and one of the oldest surviving that I know of in Perth at all. The Faith, Hope and Charity stone is very early as well. That's under the shelter, and that's fiendishly complicated, and it's made more complicated by the fact that it was partially reused. And so some of the symbolism has been obscured, but that's under the shelter at the south end of Greyfriars as well. But the Buchan stone, which is I think 1580 or thereby, must be one of the very first generation of stones that have survived. That used to be partly under a tree, I think, that had grown over it, but was rescued and placed under the shelter.
Anything to do with John Buchan?
Was that to someone famous?
John Buchan?
Not the same Buchan because it's many centuries earlier. Whether they're related, I don't know. Probably, but I'm not sure. It's a very plain stone with very little information in it.
Thanks. 1580. Mm-hmm.
Yes, but it is in there. But when I see someone is on chat is saying that if anybody wants a free copy of the Tafac volume, that can be organised. Is that Eva? Probably. Yes.
Was Eva?
Yes. So if anyone very much wants to read Mike Moy's report.
No, what is going there?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I'm at fun.
Sorry? If that's we've probably come to the end of our time, as it were, symbolically. So has anyone got a last question or comment that they want to throw in?
David, I would like to ask something.
Mm-hmm.
Down in Rye, in East Sussex, where Spike Milligan has his grave.
Oh, yes.
He wanted written on it, "I told you I was ill," but it wasn't allowed by the authorities, so he had it put into Latin.
Yes.
And I wonder, was there any restriction on what people could have on their gravestones during the times you've spoken about?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? That would anyone have wanted to scandalize their neighbors by putting something that would raise eyebrows? I'm not aware of how these things were regulated. I'm sure there were regulations. I'm sure that well, partly because you had to pay for the use of the graveyard anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that some mechanism would have been found if someone had wanted to put something scandalous on a gravestone. One of the kings, was it James, who wanted to have on his gravestone, "Here lies the worst of kings and the most wretched of men," or something like that. One of the Jameses wanted that on his tomb, but I don't think it was put there. Interesting question. I'm sure that informally there was a great deal of social pressure to determine what people were allowed to say.
Well, and you touched on the ones that were written in Greek or Hebrew or something.
Yes.
You wondered then, all right, now people can translate them, but you wondered if people who knew that person thought, well, I wonder what he's saying in there.
Yes. I think there's an element of people wanting to make a display of their learning as well as of their piety, and of it being a sort of private club, and because it would have been a very clubby sort of place, that a lot of people would have been in the Masons, or they would have been in one of the guilds, one of the incorporated crafts, and so on, so that you are very much known to your neighbours. And I've just finished rereading Middlemarch, and if you remember the funeral of the wicked old Peter, Peter Featherstone, and and how he goes out of his way to write his will and organise his funeral in order to maximise inconvenience to all his neighbours. That it's very much a social event, or an anti-social event, as the case might be, and much more of a community thing and much less of a private thing than it would be today.
Thank you very much. It was a very good evening anyway. Thank you.
Thank you.
David, thank you for a superb talk, wonderfully illustrated and just absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everyone who's been listening and watching feels exactly the same. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Yes.
Do you usually clap?
Yeah, I don't know.
There's your answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, David.
Yes. Righto. Good night, one and all.
Good night.
Good night.
Yes.
Good night.
Night, yes.
Yes.